The explosion hit before anyone heard it coming. 1 second the lead Humvee was rolling. The next, it was airborne, a black shape spinning against gray sky. And then the shockwave punched through Emily's chest like a fist made of sound. Dust swallowed the ravine whole. She was already moving, crawling. Her fingers found the ground before her eyes found anything. Somewhere behind her, men were screaming. Somewhere ahead, a second detonator wire ran beneath the gravel. She'd seen it, just barely, before the world went white. The radio on her shoulder hissed static. Dead. She pressed her cheek against cold rock and whispered anyway. "Donovan, if you can hear me, find page 47. The valley did not answer. Nobody did. The IED was buried 14 inches deep. Emily Carter knew because she dug it out herself, on her knees in the gray Afghan dirt, her fingers reading the ground the way a blind woman reads a page. The fuse assembly was crude, twisted copper wire, a pressure plate fashioned from a car door spring. But the placement was not. Someone had chosen this spot deliberately. The road curved here. The shoulder dropped away on the left. A vehicle slowing for the turn would put its front left wheel directly over the device. Not luck, geometry. She marked the location with a yellow flag and sat back on her heels. Around her, the Kandahar Plateau stretched in every direction, brown and flat and indifferent. The sky was the color of old bone. 200 meters north, the rest of Patrol Kilo waited beside their Humvees, engines idling, the soldiers watching her the way people watch someone defuse a bomb, which is to say, they watched very carefully while pretending not to. Emily pulled off her right glove and wrote the assembly specs in her notebook. Pressure plate, command wire, no secondary. She noted the wire gauge, the insulation color, the knot pattern where the wire joined the detonator cap. Details that meant nothing to most people. Details that meant everything to her. She'd been cataloging IEDs in this province for 7 months. In that time, she had logged 43 devices across 11 different construction styles. Most were amateur work, the kind of bomb that killed the person who planted it as often as the person who found it. But in the last 3 weeks, something had changed. 6 devices, all different locations, all the same knot pattern. She photographed the wire junction, capped the detonator, and stood up. Master Sergeant Jack Donovan was leaning against the hood of the lead Humvee when she walked back to the patrol. He had a paper cup of coffee that had stopped being hot an hour ago, and the expression of a man who had long since made peace with waiting. "Clean," he said. "Single device, pressure plate, command wire, no secondary." She handed him her notebook. "Look at the knot." He looked. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A small, careful adjustment, like a man recalibrating an instrument he thought he understood. "Same as the Tagab road device," he said, "and the one outside Mirabad, and the culvert en route Dallas." She took the notebook back. 6 devices in 22 days, Jack. Same knot, same wire gauge, same placement logic, always on a curve, always where the vehicle has to slow. Donovan drank his cold coffee. "You briefed this up?" "Twice. Captain Reese says it's coincidence, says these guys share techniques through the network. Reese has been stateside for 8 of the last 12 months. "I know." Donovan looked out at the plateau. The wind moved through the dry grass in slow, rolling waves. Somewhere to the east, a dog was barking at something, or at nothing. In this country, you couldn't always tell the difference. "The person who tied those knots knows what they're doing," he said. "Not Taliban standard, not a Q standard either." He handed the cup to a private passing by and straightened up. "Keep logging. Something that deliberate leaves a pattern eventually." Emily nodded and climbed into the Humvee. She didn't say what she was already thinking, that a pattern was only useful if you lived long enough to read it. FOB. Sentinel sat at the mouth of a valley like a man standing in a doorway he wasn't sure he wanted to enter. The base had been established 3 years ago as a temporary position and had calcified into permanence the way temporary things do in war. Through accumulated infrastructure, institutional inertia, and the quiet understanding that nobody was really sure what leaving would look like. There were now 24 structures inside the wire, ranging from hardened concrete bunkers to plywood bee huts that leaked when it rained and cooked in summer. There was a motor pool, a TOC, a small aid station, and a gym that consisted of a pull-up bar and 2 sandbags filled to different weights. Emily had a corner cot in a bee hut shared with 3 other female soldiers. She kept her space organized with the precision of someone who understood that disorder in small things led to disorder in large ones. Her notebook lived in the same pocket every time. Her tools were laid out in the same sequence every night. Her boots were always laced the same way, left over right, double knot, tucked. Small rituals. They didn't keep you safe, but they kept you sharp, and sharp was the closest thing to safe that existed out here. She was rewriting her IED log that evening when Donovan appeared in the doorway of the bee hut. He knocked on the frame even though there was no door, which was something she'd noticed about him from the first week. A kind of old-fashioned courtesy that sat strangely on a man who had clearly done very violent things. "Convoy brief is at 0600, he said. She kept writing. "I know. Route runs through Black Ravine." She stopped writing. Black Ravine was a 3-kilometer stretch of road cut between 2 ridgelines south of the FOB. The road was single lane. The walls rose 30 meters on either side. At the southern exit, the road crossed a concrete bridge over a seasonal creek bed. The ravine had been used twice in the past year for ambushes. Both times the convoys had taken casualties before reaching the bridge. "Captain Reese approved the route?" she asked. Captain Reese approved the route. Emily closed her notebook. "Is there an alternate?" "Alternate adds 4 hours and crosses the Ghazni district boundary. Reese says the timeline doesn't support it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing dust against the walls of the bee hut with a sound like distant static. "Has anyone done a route clearance on the ravine in the last 72 hours? 48 hours ago. Clean. 48 hours is enough time to plant 6 devices." Donovan said nothing. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with the particular patience of a man who has learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is simply not fill the silence. "I'll be ready at 600, she said. He nodded once and left. Emily opened her notebook again. She wrote 2 words at the top of a fresh page. Black Ravine. Then she sat for a long time, listening to the wind, thinking about geometry. The convoy assembled in the motor pool at 0545. 5 vehicles, 2 gun trucks fore and aft, 2 logistics Humvees carrying medical supplies and ammunition to Combat Outpost Reyes, and a command vehicle in the center. 14 soldiers, including the drivers. Emily rode in the 3rd vehicle with her EOD kit and Specialist Danny Okafor, her assistant, who was 23 years old and had been in country for 11 weeks and still occasionally looked surprised by things. Donovan was not officially part of the convoy. He was a contract technical advisor, a retired Green Beret brought back in by the Army's Irregular Advisory Program to consult on IED threat assessment in the province. His formal role did not include convoy operations. He showed up anyway because that was the kind of person he was, and because nobody with any operational sense was going to tell Jack Donovan he couldn't get in a vehicle. He rode in the command vehicle, 2 positions ahead of Emily. Route clearance protocol. Emily's vehicle would move to the front of the column whenever the terrain required EOD assessment. Until then, she monitored from the 3rd position, scanning the roadside through the window, reading the ground. The sun was still low when they entered Black Ravine. The walls closed in immediately. That was the first thing you noticed, not the shadows, not the cold air that had pooled in the cut overnight, but the sudden compression of space, the way the sky shrank to a strip of pale gray between two ridgelines. The sound changed too. The engine noise bounced off the rock walls and came back flattened. Strange. Emily pressed her face to the window and watched the road shoulder. Nothing in the first 300 meters. Bare rock and gravel, the occasional scrub of dry vegetation. A rusted fuel drum someone had dragged to the roadside years ago and abandoned. Normal debris, background noise. 400 meters in, she saw the first flag. Not a flag, a small stone, placed on top of a larger stone, slightly off the natural scatter of the ground. A marker. Someone had been here recently and left a navigation reference. "Stop," she said. The driver braked. The convoy concertinaed, vehicle by vehicle, coming to rest in the ravine. Emily was out before the dust settled. The stone marker was 6 inches off the road shoulder. Below it, 8 inches down, she found the first device. It was different. Not in its components. The pressure plate, the wire, the detonator cap were all consistent with the pattern she'd been logging. But the placement was wrong. It was too close to the surface, too easy to find. She stood up and turned in a slow circle, studying the road, the walls, the shadows. Why would you bury it shallow? Because you want it to be found. The thought arrived fully formed and cold. She keyed her radio. "Donovan, this device is a marker, not a weapon. Someone wants us to find it." A pause. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking there are more devices in this ravine, and this one is telling us where to look." She scanned the road ahead. The surface was unmarked, gravel, rock, nothing obvious. But at the far end of the ravine, maybe 600 meters north, she could see the concrete bridge. "If I wanted to trap a convoy in this ravine, I'd put the real devices at the entry and the exit. Block both ends. No egress." Another pause, longer this time. "Get back in the vehicle," Donovan said. "Not yet." She walked the road shoulder slowly, reading the ground the way she'd been trained. Not looking at the surface, but at the relationship between things. The pattern of disturbance. The places where something had touched the earth and left a trace. 50 meters ahead, she found the second marker stone. She didn't touch it. Behind her, she heard a vehicle door open. Donovan. "Carter, there's a second marker, 50 meters up, left shoulder." She pointed without turning around. "These aren't random. They're spaced to create a kill zone. Entry, midpoint, exit. 3 devices, triangulated." Donovan came up beside her. He looked at the road ahead with a flat, assessing gaze of someone doing rapid mental geometry. "Entry device we found," he said. "That's one. The exit would be near the bridge approach. The midpoint," she stopped. From somewhere above them, on the eastern ridgeline, she heard a sound. Very faint, the metallic click of something adjusting against rock. They both heard it. "Sniper?" Okafor said from behind them. "No," Emily said. "Spotter." They moved the convoy back 200 meters to the widest point of the ravine entry. Donovan got on the radio to the FOB, while Emily set up a hasty perimeter assessment with the 2 gun trucks. The soldiers dismounted and took positions against the rock walls, watching the ridgelines. The spotter, if that's what it was, had gone silent. Emily briefed the convoy commander, Lieutenant Hargrove, a 26-year-old ranger-tabbed officer who was competent and careful, and clearly trying not to show that this situation exceeded his experience. "We have confirmed 1 device at the entry point," she said. "Strong indicators of at least 2 more, midpoint and bridge approach. The placement pattern in the presence of a spotter indicates this isn't a standard roadside bomb. Someone set this up to catch a convoy inside the ravine and hold it there." Hargrove looked at the ravine entrance. "What's the threat assessment on the ridgeline?" "Unknown. The spotter means there's a triggerman somewhere, someone waiting to initiate on command rather than pressure plate. That means they have communications. That means there's a network. Can you clear the route?" Emily looked at Donovan. He gave her nothing, just waited, the same way he always waited, letting her find her own answer. The entry device, yes. The midpoint and exit, not without knowing where exactly they are. I'd be walking blind past the first marker. Time estimate for full clearance? 4 to 6 hours minimum if I work carefully, more if the midpoint device is complex. Hargrove checked his watch. The supply delivery to Cap Reyes was already 2 hours overdue. Medical supplies, ammunition. The outpost had been running short on both. I'll contact FOB for a decision, he said. While Hargrove radioed back, Emily walked to Donovan's position at the edge of the perimeter. There's something else, she said quietly. Tell me. The knot pattern on the entry device. I checked it twice. She opened her notebook to the page with her comparison sketches. 6 devices, all documented. It's not just the same technique. It's the same hands. The same person tied all 6 knots. Donovan studied the sketches. You can tell that from a knot? A knot is a signature. The tension, the wrap sequence, the tail length. It's as individual as handwriting. Whoever is building these devices has been in this province for at least 3 weeks, moving around, placing devices in a pattern. She paused. This is reconnaissance, Jack. These IEDs aren't the main effort. They're data collection. Someone is studying how we respond. Donovan was very still for a moment. You brief this to Reese? Reese will say I'm reading too much into wire gauge. Brief it anyway, in writing, today. His voice had shifted, quieter, more precise. The voice of a man who had stopped being a technical advisor and had become something older. If you're right, you need a paper trail. Before she could answer, Hargrove returned. His expression had settled into the careful neutrality of a man carrying bad news professionally. FOB says proceed with clearance, he said. Priority delivery to Reyes. We have a 6-hour window before dark. Emily closed her notebook. All right, she said. Give me room to work. She neutralized the entry device in 40 minutes. The process was methodical. Approach, assess, disrupt. She used a hook and line first to test for anti-handling devices, a secondary trigger designed to kill the person trying to disarm the primary. Nothing. Then she cut the command wire 12 inches from the detonator cap, isolating the device from its trigger mechanism. Then she excavated carefully, photographing each layer until the pressure plate was exposed and she could remove the main charge. The main charge was 2 kilograms of homemade explosive, packed in a plastic container that had once held cooking oil. She held it for a moment before placing it in the disposal bag. 2 kilograms, shaped and placed correctly, would have destroyed the front axle of a Humvee, killed anyone in the front seats, and likely initiated a rollover that would block the ravine entirely. Clean work, precise work. She photographed the completed excavation and sealed her bag. Okafor, who had been providing security 10 meters back, came forward when she gave the all-clear signal. He looked at the components laid out on the ground with the expression he always had after a successful disarm. Relief mixed with something she recognized as the particular kind of awe that comes from realizing how close the world just came to being different. Same guy, he said. Same knot. She was already standing, scanning the road ahead toward the second marker stone. Pack this up and log it. I'm moving to the midpoint. The midpoint device was more complex. She found it 18 inches down, directly beneath the second marker stone. The pressure plate was the same. The wire gauge was the same. But the main charge was larger, 4 kilograms, packed into 2 containers connected by a short length of det cord. Dual initiation. If the first container failed to fully detonate, the second would complete the function. More sophisticated, more destructive. She was photographing the dual container configuration when her radio crackled. Carter, Donovan's voice. Something in his tone made her stop. Go ahead. We have a signal. Someone's broadcasting on the emergency intercept frequency. Automated. Repeating. A pause. It's coming from the ridgeline. Eastern side, approximately 300 meters up. Emily sat back on her heels and looked up at the rock wall rising above her. A signal repeater, planted on the ridgeline, broadcasting to trigger the devices remotely, overriding the pressure plates, allowing command detonation from a safe distance, which meant the devices could be initiated not when a vehicle drove over them, but when someone watching decided the time was right. The entry device had no receiver, she said. I know, which means the entry device was always meant to be found. It was bait. She stood up slowly. The real kill shot is the midpoint and the exit, triggered when the convoy is fully committed inside the ravine. A long pause. Can you disrupt the repeater signal? Donovan asked. Not from here. Someone needs to get to the transmitter. She looked at the eastern ridgeline. The rock face was steep but not vertical. There were ledges, natural footholds, places where a person could climb if they were careful and didn't mind the exposure. I can climb it. That is not. The midpoint device is too close to the bridge approach for me to safely disrupt it while the repeater is active. If someone initiates remotely while I'm working, I'm in the blast radius. She was already measuring the climb with her eyes. I go up, I disable the transmitter, I come back down, I finish the disarm. Clean sequence. Silence on the radio. Jack. I heard you, he said. I don't like it. I know. She shouldered her kit. Tell Hargrove I need 20 minutes. The climb took 35 minutes. The rock was cold and dry, which was good. Cold rock held its texture, gave her edges to grip. The problem was her kit. The EOD pack added 12 kilograms to her back and shifted her center of gravity backward, toward the drop. She climbed slowly, testing each hold before committing, her breathing controlled, her mind entirely on the immediate problem of the next 3 feet. Halfway up, she found a ledge wide enough to rest on. She pressed her back against the rock and looked down at the ravine. The convoy was a thin line of vehicles below, miniaturized by height. She could see Donovan's silhouette near the third vehicle, watching her. She could see the soldiers in their perimeter positions, watching the ridgelines. She could see the road, the marker stones, the place where she'd left her tools beside the midpoint excavation. From up here, the geometry of the trap was visible in a way it hadn't been from the ground. The 3 device positions formed a triangle. The entry device at the mouth of the ravine, close enough to disable the lead vehicle and block retreat. The midpoint device, positioned to catch vehicles that had driven past the entry but not yet reached the exit. The exit device at the bridge approach, to close the far end. 3 points, 1 containment zone. She thought about the person who had designed this, the patience of it, the advanced reconnaissance required. Someone had walked this ravine, measured distances, thought about vehicle spacing, planned for multiple contingencies. This wasn't a bomb made in a hurry. This was a system built by someone with training. She pulled out her notebook and sketched the triangle on a fresh page, noting distances and angles. She wrote a single line below it. Not local knowledge, formal tactical education. Then she kept climbing. The transmitter was exactly where Donovan had triangulated it. A compact device no larger than a hardback book, wedged into a rock crevice and anchored with wire. It was military-grade hardware, not improvised, not commercial. The type of frequency transmitter that appeared in export-controlled lists, the kind that required specific procurement channels. She photographed it from 3 angles before touching it. Then she removed the antenna assembly, severed the power connection, and placed the intact device in her kit. Below her, the radio crackled. Donovan's voice, clipped and urgent. Carter, shots fired. Eastern ridgeline, north of your position. Someone knows you found it. The first round hit the rock face 6 inches from her left hand. She flattened against the ledge and heard the second round skip off the stone above her head. A sharp, high crack, not the deep report of a large caliber. A light weapon, probably an AK variant, fired from distance, probably not by a trained marksman, or she'd already be dead. But distance closed fast when you were stationary on an exposed rock face. She started moving down. "Taking fire," she said into the radio. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Descending. Keep the convoy tight. Copy." A beat. "Move faster, Staff Sergeant." She moved faster. The descent was controlled falling, not climbing down but dropping, catching herself on holds, releasing before she was fully stable, trusting momentum over caution. 2 more rounds hit the rock above her. Then nothing. Either the shooter had lost the angle, or the soldiers below had returned fire and complicated his position. She hit the ravine floor hard, rolled, came up in a crouch behind a boulder. Okafor was there immediately, pulling her to cover. "You okay?" She checked herself, scraped palms, torn trouser knee, nothing structural. "Fine." She held up the transmitter. "Got it." Donovan arrived 30 seconds later, moving in a low run. He looked at the transmitter in her hand, then at her scraped palms, then at her face. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Part 1 is done," he said finally. "You killed the remote trigger. The midpoint device is still active. Pressure plate only now, no command detonation." She was already moving back toward her tools. "I need to finish the disarm." "Carter, the convoy has to get through, Jack." She looked back at him over her shoulder. "COP Reyes is waiting on those supplies." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and fell into position covering her back. She picked up her tools and walked toward the midpoint device. The valley walls rose on either side, silent now, the shooter gone to ground or gone entirely. The wind moved through the ravine with a sound like something breathing. She knelt in the dirt and went back to work. The midpoint disarm took 51 minutes. The dual container configuration required her to sever the det cord, connecting the 2 charges before touching either one. If she disrupted the main charge first and the initiator was spring-loaded, the secondary would still fire. She worked the det cord first, cutting it in 2 places to ensure isolation, then excavated the first container fully, then the second. By the time she bagged the last component, her knees ached and the light in the ravine had shifted. The sun had moved far enough west that the eastern wall was in shadow, the temperature dropping perceptibly. Okafor helped her carry the disposal bags back to the vehicle. 3 devices total, she told Hargrove when she reported. Entry, midpoint, confirmed. The exit device at the bridge approach. I haven't physically located it yet, but based on the pattern, it will be within 50 meters of the bridge deck, left shoulder, buried 18 to 24 inches. Can you clear it? Yes, give me 30 minutes. She found the exit device in 22. It was exactly where she'd predicted. 40 meters from the bridge approach, left shoulder, 20 inches deep. Same construction as the midpoint device. Same knot, same hands. She disarmed it without incident and stood up, brushing dirt from her knees, and looked at the bridge. The concrete was old and cracked, the railing rusted. Beyond it, the ravine opened into a wide valley that stretched south toward Cap Reyes. Open ground, defensible, safe relative to where they'd spent the last 3 hours. The convoy crossed the bridge at 1340 hours. Emily sat in the third vehicle and watched the ravine walls recede behind them. Okafor was writing up his field notes in the seat beside her, his pen moving quickly, getting the details down while they were fresh. She trained him to do that, always write before the adrenaline fades, because the body remembers details the mind discards. She opened her own notebook. She wrote the inventory of the 3 devices, components, dimensions, placement depths. She sketched the triangle again, more carefully this time, with measured distances. She noted the transmitter, military grade, export controlled, not consistent with locally available materials. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote a heading, External Involvement, Indicators. Below it she wrote 4 bullet points, the knot signature, consistent across 6 devices, indicating a single builder. The transmitter hardware, procurement level inconsistent with local insurgent networks, the tactical placement geometry, formal military education, not organic knowledge. The spotter on the ridgeline, coordinated observation, suggesting trained reconnaissance. She stared at the list for a long time. Someone with resources, training, and a long-term operational plan was running IED operations in this province. Not for maximum casualties. If that had been the goal, the entry device would have been the primary, not the bait. The goal was something else. Containment, study, possibly provocation. But why? She wrote the question at the bottom of the page and underlined it twice. Donovan appeared in the seat beside her. He'd moved up from the command vehicle at some point during the crossing. He looked at her notebook without asking, which was something he did sometimes, and which she'd stopped minding because his read was usually useful. "You're building a case," he said. "I'm building a log." "Same thing." He studied the bullet points. "You know what this looks like. It looks like someone is testing response patterns. It looks like a prelude." He handed the notebook back. "Something larger is being planned. These devices are measuring us. Reaction time, clearance capability, convoy spacing, radio protocols." His voice was level, but she heard the thing underneath it. The thing that came from experience, from having been in a situation that started this way before. "Brief this to Reese tonight, everything, the transmitter hardware especially." "He won't act on it." "Brief it anyway." He met her eyes. "In writing, date stamped. If something happens and your analysis was on record, then at least someone can say we knew." "At least there's a record," he said. "That's not nothing." The valley opened around them, brown and wide and full of late afternoon light. Emily closed her notebook and looked out the window at the terrain. The ridge lines, the dry creek beds, the places where the ground folded in ways that could conceal movement. She was thinking about page 47. She'd labeled it that morning, arbitrarily, the next available page in her current notebook. The page where she'd started the external involvement list. She didn't know yet why that page number would matter. She tucked the notebook back in her pocket, right side, always right side, and watched the road ahead. The debrief at Cop Reyes lasted 20 minutes. Emily sat at the end of a folding table in the outpost's TOC, a single hardened room with maps on every wall and the smell of diesel and unwashed clothes baked permanently into the concrete, and walked Lieutenant Hargrove through the full sequence. 3 devices, triangle formation, remote trigger via military-grade transmitter, sniper or spotter on the eastern ridgeline. She laid the components on the table as she spoke, the pressure plates, the wire sections, the intact transmitter. Hargrove listened carefully. He was a good lieutenant. He took notes. He asked clarifying questions. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he looked at the transmitter for a long moment. "This hardware," he said, "you're saying it's not locally sourced." "Export-controlled frequency range. The antenna assembly is a specific military standard, NATO adjacent, not Warsaw Pact legacy. This didn't come out of a bazaar in Kandahar." She slid her notebook across the table to the sketch of the transmitter with its component labels. "Someone procured this through a supply chain, which means funding, which means organizational infrastructure." "Yes," Hargrove looked at Donovan. "You concur with this assessment?" Donovan was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching the exchange. "I've seen transmitters like this once before. Helmand, 2009. That situation turned out to involve facilitation from outside the province." He paused. "We didn't figure that out until after we'd lost 6 people." The room was quiet for a moment. "I'll forward this to Brigade," Hargrove said. "The transmitter goes to the technical exploitation team at Kandahar." He looked at Emily. "Good work, Staff Sergeant." "Sir," she took her notebook back. "There's one more thing. The device pattern across the province. 6 IEDs in 22 days. All same construction, same placement logic. I believe the builder is doing route reconnaissance, mapping our response protocols, measuring clearance times. She paused. The Black Ravine setup was too elaborate for a standard interdiction. Someone wanted to know how we handle a multi-device complex under fire. Hargrove absorbed this. You think it was a test? I think it was data collection. He nodded slowly. I'll include that in the brigade report. She didn't say what she was thinking. That brigade reports took 48 hours to process. That 48 hours was enough time to place 6 more devices. That whoever was running this operation was moving faster than the reporting chain could follow. She collected her components, thanked Hargrove, and walked out into the Cop Reyes compound. The sun was low, the shadows long, the air already carrying the sharp cold of the Afghan evening. She found a quiet corner near the perimeter wall, sat on a sandbag, and opened her notebook. She wrote at the top of page 47, Black Ravine, external involvement. Then she started building the case from scratch. Everything she knew, everything she suspected, organized not as a field log, but as an analytical argument, the kind of document that could survive her absence. She wasn't thinking about her absence specifically. She was thinking about clarity, about making sure the information was usable by someone who hadn't been there. But she wrote for 3 hours, until the light was completely gone and she was working by the cold blue glow of a headlamp, and she wrote more than she needed to for a simple field report. When she was done, she read it back once. Then she closed the notebook and went to find a cot. They returned to FOB Sentinel the next morning via the alternate route. 4 hours of bad road through the Ghazni district boundary, which Captain Reese had deemed unnecessary the day before, and which now, with 3 IEDs logged from Black Ravine, nobody was in a position to argue against. The ride was long and rough and mostly silent. Emily slept for 90 minutes in the back of the Humvee, her head against the window, her notebook pressed against her chest under her crossed arms. She dreamed about wire, the specific texture of copper wire between her fingers, the resistance it gave before it cut. When she woke up, Donovan was watching her from the opposite seat. "You were talking," he said. "What did I say?" "Same hands." He looked out the window at the terrain passing. "Twice." She sat up and checked that the notebook was still there. It was. She rubbed her face and looked out at the road, the dry brown hills rolling past, a distant village, the occasional shepherd with a flock that moved like smoke across the slope. "I want to pull all the device logs from the province," she said. "Not just mine. Every EOD unit operating in Kandahar and Helmand for the last 6 months. Cross-reference construction signatures." "You think the same builder has been working a wider area?" "I think if someone is doing route reconnaissance, they're not doing it in one valley. They're building a picture." She turned from the window. The Black Ravine setup wasn't the first. It's too refined, too confident. That's the work of someone who's run this sequence before and knows it works. Donovan considered this. "Brigade won't turn that data around in time to be useful." "I know. I'm going to request it directly from the EOD company at Kandahar. Sergeant Major Okafor knows the company's sergeant there." "Okafor is 23. He's effective." She pulled out the notebook. "I'm also going to write up a formal threat assessment and route it around Reese to S2 at Brigade. Direct channel." Donovan looked at her steadily. "Reese won't like being bypassed." "No." She opened the notebook. "But Reese isn't the one finding the devices." A long pause. The vehicle hit a rut and bounced hard, and everyone grabbed something, and then the road smoothed out again. "Be careful with Reese," Donovan said finally. "Not because he's dangerous, because he's the kind of man who responds to being undermined by making decisions that put people in difficult positions." His voice was quiet and precise. "I've known commanders like him. They don't fire you, they just route you to the bad assignments." Emily wrote a sentence in her notebook. "Noted." "I'm serious, Carter." "I know you are." She looked up. "I'm also serious. If my analysis is right, and I don't get it on record, And then something happens. Then at least there's documentation, he said. I know. I told you the same thing yesterday. So we agree. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the road curved around the base of a hill, and for a few seconds the FOB was visible in the distance. The low profile of the walls, the antennas, the flag. We agree, he said. Back at FOB Sentinel, Emily spent the afternoon in the EOD workspace, a hardened container unit behind the motor pool where she kept her equipment, her logs, and the growing collection of component samples she'd been assembling over 7 months. It looked, to anyone who entered, like organized chaos. It was actually a filing system she'd designed herself, organized by construction signature rather than date or location. She pulled every IED log from the previous 3 months and laid them out on the work table. 43 devices across 11 construction styles. She'd identified the styles early. She thought of them as handwriting types, like how a classroom of students learning the same script would each develop slightly different letter forms. Style 1, crude pressure plate, no anti-handling, short command wire. Style 2, more sophisticated pressure plate, occasional anti-handling, longer wire. And so on through Style 11. The knot signature she'd found in Black Ravine appeared in Style 7, which she'd first cataloged 6 weeks ago in a device found on Route Atlanta, east of Kandahar City. She pulled the Route Atlanta log. Same knot, same wire gauge. She pulled the next Style 7 device. Same. She pulled all of them. 8 Style 7 devices over 6 weeks, spread across a 40-kilometer radius. A pattern she hadn't seen before because she'd been classifying by style, not by signature. And the signature was subtler than the style. The 8 devices formed a rough circle. She stared at the map she'd pinned to the container wall and traced the circle with her finger. The radius was consistent, roughly 20 kilometers from a center point. She found the center point, an uninhabited valley south of a dry riverbed called Wadi Khasro. No road, no village, nothing on any map that justified the attention. She stared at the center point for a long time. Then she went to find Donovan. She found him in the gym, the 2 sandbags in the pull-up bar, not working out but sitting on an ammo crate, reading something on a field tablet. He looked up when she came in. She handed him the map without preamble. The 8 device locations were marked in red, the center point circled in blue. He looked at it for a long time. Wadi Khasro, he said. You know it? I know of it. Passed through in 2004. He studied the circle. There was a structure there then, old Khalat, mud brick compound, abandoned, roof partially collapsed. We assessed it as non-significant. Non-significant in 2004. He looked at her. Non-significant in 2004, he agreed. I want to request aerial reconnaissance of that grid. Through Reese. Through Reese. She took the map back. Or around him, if he says no. Donovan closed the tablet. He looked at the map one more time, then at her. Brief him tonight. Request formal. I'll be there. She nodded and rolled the map. She was almost to the door when Donovan spoke again. Carter. She stopped. What you found today, the circle, the center point, if you're right about what's at Wadi Khasro, this goes beyond IED assessment. His voice was level. You understand that. I understand it. If there's infrastructure there, if there's an operation running out of that location, then whoever is running it knows you've been finding their devices. They know because the Black Ravine setup failed. He paused. They may know who cleared Black Ravine. The container was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the motor pool, a wrench hit concrete with a sharp clang. I'll sleep with the notebook under my pillow, Emily said. It wasn't a joke. He didn't laugh. Keep it with you, he said. All of it. Everything on page 47. She left the container and walked back across the FOB toward the TOC. The map rolled in her hand, the notebook in her pocket. thinking about circles and center points and the quality of silence in a valley where nothing was supposed to be. Captain Reese said no. He said it politely, which was how he did most things, with a calm, managerial authority that made disagreement feel not like a debate, but like a process error. He reviewed Emily's map and her documentation for approximately 4 minutes, asked 2 clarifying questions about her methodology for identifying construction signatures, and then told her that while her analysis was interesting, the evidentiary threshold for a reconnaissance request was significant asset expenditure that required corroboration from multiple intelligence sources. He had a way of saying intelligence sources that implied EOD field logs did not qualify. "I'll note your assessment in the threat annex of the weekly report," he said, and handed her map back. "Good work on the Black Ravine clearance." Emily took the map. She did not look at Donovan, who was standing 2 feet to her left. She could feel him not saying anything with considerable precision. "Sir," she said and left. Outside the TOC, in the dust of the FOB compound, she stood for a moment and breathed. Donovan came out behind her. He walked past her and kept walking toward the EOD workspace. After a moment, she followed. Inside the container, he sat down on the ammo crate and looked at the map she'd spread on the work table. "S2 direct channel," she said. "S2 direct channel," he agreed. "I have a contact, Captain Weiss, Brigade Intelligence. We were at Bragg together, 2001. He pulled out his own field notebook, battered, much older than hers, the cover held together with a rubber band. "I'll make a call tonight. Unofficial. Get eyes on the concept before we submit formally. Reese will find out. Eventually." He wrote something in his notebook. "By then it won't matter, one way or the other." Emily pinned the map back on the wall and stood looking at the circle of device locations. 8 red marks, 1 blue circle at Wadi Khosrow. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Not the mission, the whole thing. The accumulation of reading landscapes and finding patterns and pushing up against the institutional resistance that always seemed to sit between good intelligence and timely action." Donovan considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't deflect or give her a veteran's quip about years of service. "Long enough to know that the information is almost never the problem," he said. "The problem is the chain between the information and the decision." He closed his notebook. "You've done the hard part. You found it. Now we work the chain." She nodded. She pulled out her notebook and opened to page 47. She added a line at the bottom of the analytical document. "Wadi Khosrow, Potential Operational Center. Request denied by CO. Routing to Brigade S2 through informal channel. Date, time, her initials." The record existed. Whatever happened next, the record existed. 2 days later, Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb died. He was the senior NCO of 2nd Platoon, a 12-year veteran who had been scheduled to rotate home in 3 weeks. He was riding in the lead vehicle of a patrol en route Dallas when a Style 7 device detonated under the front axle. The blast killed Webb instantly and wounded 2 other soldiers, one critically. Emily was at the site within 90 minutes of the call-out. The device had been placed at a road junction, not on a curve this time, but at a T intersection where the road widened slightly to accommodate turning vehicles. The placement was adjusted for the new geometry. Same knot, same wire gauge, adapted execution. The builder had changed the location logic without changing the signature. She documented everything and said nothing to anyone at the scene that she hadn't already put in writing. But standing over the excavated device with Webb's covered body 20 meters away, and the 2 wounded soldiers already medevaced, she felt something shift in her chest. Not grief exactly, not yet, but the precursor to it. The recognition that the gap between her analysis and Reese's response had now cost a specific person a specific future. 3 weeks from going home. She knew things about Webb that most people on the FOB didn't. Not because they were close, they weren't particularly, but because she paid attention. He kept a photograph tucked inside his helmet pad. His daughter, maybe 4 years old, sitting on a porch swing somewhere green and civilian. He drank his coffee with exactly 2 sugars and complained if the ratio was wrong. He had a habit of checking his watch not to see the time, but as a gesture of anticipation, counting down in some private way the days remaining. She had noticed all of these things because noticing was what she did. She noted them now on the inside of the container of her chest, where they would stay. She closed her notebook and went back to work. That evening, she wrote a second formal threat assessment and routed it not just to S2, but to the EOD company at Kandahar, to the regional IED task force, and, through Donovan's contact at Brigade, to Captain Weiss. She attached her full device log, the map with the circle, the transmitter hardware photographs, and a chronological timeline of all 9 Style 7 devices. She wrote a cover note that was 2 sentences long. The attached documents represent a 7-week pattern of IED placement consistent with coordinated reconnaissance and operational preparation. I am requesting immediate aerial assessment of grid reference AT447229, designated Wadi Khosrow. She sent it at 2300 hours and lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling and waited. The response from Brigade S2 came 36 hours later, not from Captain Weiss, from a Major Chen in the intelligence section, which was the first sign that something had moved up the chain unexpectedly. The message was brief. Her request for aerial reconnaissance of Wadi Khosrow had been received and was under review. In the meantime, she was instructed to submit all device samples and documentation to the technical exploitation team at Kandahar Airfield for formal analysis. She read the message twice. Under review was not a no. It was also not a yes. Donovan read it over her shoulder. Chen is 1 level above Weiss. The request escalated. Why would it escalate? Because Weiss showed it to someone who recognized what it meant. He straightened up. Someone at Brigade has seen this pattern before. She looked at the message again. Under review. How long does review take? Depends on what else they're looking at. He paused. And who else is looking? The phrase sat in the air between them for a moment. You think there's a compartmentalized operation, she said. It wasn't a question. I think it's possible. If there's already an intelligence operation targeting the same network, they wouldn't broadcast it. They'd put a hold on incoming requests while they assess whether the new data is a threat to their operations' security. Emily thought about this. So my request might be sitting on someone's desk while they decide whether I know too much. Or whether you're a useful source, Donovan said. Or whether your analysis is consistent with what they already have. He shrugged slightly. Intel politics. I've never enjoyed them. She submitted the device samples to Kandahar as instructed and went back to her workbench. She pulled out the transmitter. She'd kept the photographs, though the physical device had already been shipped. She studied the antenna assembly again, the specific mounting bracket, the frequency range. She'd looked it up 3 days ago in the technical manual database and found the model number. A Thales derivative system, European manufacture, used primarily by NATO Special Operations units and certain contractor security organizations. Contractor security organizations. She wrote it on page 47 and underlined it. She pulled up the procurement database she had access to through the EOD technical portal, a limited access system intended for component identification, not procurement investigation. But it contained enough cross-reference data to be useful. The Thales derivative model appeared in procurement records for 3 contractor organizations operating in the region. 2 were legitimate logistics firms with verifiable DoD contracts. The third had a registration address in a jurisdiction she didn't recognize and no publicly listed operations. She wrote the name down, Meridian Technical Solutions. A search of the name in the unclassified databases she could access returned almost nothing. A corporate registration, a single reference in a DoD vendor list from 2019, and one mention in a regional contracting notice that had since been removed. The removal was recent. The metadata on the notice indicated it had been live as recently as 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, the same week the first Style 7 device appeared. She stared at the name for a long time. Then she heard boots outside the container, and the door opened. And it wasn't Okafor or Donovan. It was Captain Reese. He stood in the doorway and looked at the map on the wall. The red marks, the blue circle, the device logs pinned beneath it, with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "Staff Sergeant Carter," he said, "I understand you submitted a reconnaissance request through an informal brigade channel." She met his eyes. "I routed a formal threat assessment to multiple appropriate recipients, sir, including Brigade S2, bypassing the company chain of command. I followed up through the chain of command in person, sir, on Tuesday. The request was declined." Reese stepped fully into the container and let the door fall shut behind him. He looked at the map for a moment, then at her. "You're a good technical operator, Carter, one of the best I've seen." His voice was even, professionally warm. "But threat analysis at the operational level requires context that field-level assessment doesn't always capture. There are factors at play in this province that aren't visible from an EOD workbench." She said nothing. "I need you to understand that my decisions are made with a full operational picture." He paused. "And I need you to operate within the established reporting structure." "Sergeant First Class Webb is dead, sir." The container was very quiet. "I'm aware of that," Reese said. "He died on a Style 7 device, the 9th device in a pattern I have been documenting for 7 weeks. I briefed this pattern to you twice before Tuesday's request and submitted written assessments each time." Her voice remained level. She'd spent 2 days preparing to say this. "My assessment is on record. Your responses are on record. I am continuing to document." Reese looked at her for a long moment. His expression had not changed, still that careful, professional neutrality. But something behind it had shifted, the way Donovan's eyes had shifted when she showed him the not comparison, a recalibration. "Keep doing your job, Staff Sergeant," he said. "That's all I'm asking." He left. Emily turned back to her workbench. Her hands were completely steady. She was surprised by that. She opened the notebook to page 47 and wrote, "Direct conversation with CO Re, reporting chain. No formal action taken. Pattern documentation continuing. Date, time, initials." Then she sat down and started building the next layer of the analytical document. Because Reese had just told her something, even though he hadn't meant to. He'd said there are factors at play that aren't visible from an EOD workbench. He knew something, or he'd been told something, or someone had told him to manage her. She wrote that too. On the 4th morning after Black Ravine, they got the aerial imagery, not from Weiss or Chen, from Donovan, who received it through a channel he didn't name and presented it to Emily on his field tablet at 0630 while the FOB was still waking up. The images were high-resolution, thermal and optical, time-stamped from 2 nights ago, covering a 4-kilometer radius around Wadi Khosrow. The old Kalat was not abandoned. 2 structures had been added to the compound since 2004. Prefabricated modules, the type used by contractor logistics organizations and NGOs, but configured here in a way that suggested operational use rather than humanitarian. There were vehicle tracks in the wadi floor, heavy vehicles based on the tread width. There was a communications antenna on the highest point of the original structure. And in the thermal imaging, taken at 0200 local time, there were heat signatures consistent with 6 to 8 personnel and 2 running generators. Emily studied the images for a long time without speaking. "Someone has been living there," she said finally. "Someone has been operating there," Donovan said. "There's a difference. Living suggests permanence. Operating suggests they'll move when they're done. She looked at the vehicle tracks. These are recent, within the week. My contact says the thermal signatures have been consistent for at least 3 weeks, but the vehicle pattern changed 4 days ago. More activity, heavier loads going in. 4 days ago, the day after Black Ravine. They're accelerating, she said. The clearance of their devices forced a timeline change, or confirmed they'd collected enough data. Donovan sat back. Either way, the operation is entering a different phase. Emily looked at the communications antenna in the optical image. The transmitter from the ridgeline, military-grade, NATO-adjacent frequency range, and now an antenna at the operational center. She was thinking about what Reese had said. Factors at play that aren't visible from an EOD workbench. And what Donovan had suggested, a compartmentalized intelligence operation, a hold placed on incoming requests while someone assessed the new data. What if the compartmentalized operation isn't working against this network? She said carefully. What if it's connected to it? Donovan was very still. That's a significant accusation. It's a hypothesis. She pointed to the prefabricated modules in the image. Contractor hardware, contractor procurement transmitter, professional tactical training. Someone is funding and equipping and training the people who built those devices. She looked at him. The funding has to come from somewhere. The equipment has to be procured through a channel. And when I submitted my analysis to Brigade, someone above Weiss's level put it under review immediately. Not to act on it, but to assess whether I was a security risk to an existing operation. The silence stretched. If you're right, Donovan said slowly, then the people who should be acting on your analysis are the same people who have an interest in it not reaching anyone who would act on it. Yes. He looked at the images for a long moment. She watched him working through it, not the tactical analysis, which he'd done faster than she had, but the institutional implications. The weight of what it meant if the chain of command itself was compromised. Who do you trust? He said. The question was direct and genuine, not rhetorical. You, she said. Okafor, Hargrove, I think. He's too young to have been brought in on anything, and too straight to play along if he was. She paused. That's the list. Donovan nodded. He took the tablet back and closed the images. I'm going to make some calls. People I trust from before, people outside this command structure. He stood up. Keep building the document. Everything on page 47, make it complete. Dates, images, analysis, all of it. And if something happens before your calls go through, he looked at her with the flat, serious gaze of a man who had learned not to offer reassurances he couldn't guarantee. Then page 47 needs to be enough on its own, he said. Whoever finds it needs to be able to pick up where you left off. She held the notebook a little tighter without meaning to. Go make your calls, she said. The next 36 hours were the longest of Emily's deployment. Donovan made his calls. He would not tell her exactly who he was talking to, but she could read the progression in his demeanor. The first day careful and exploratory, the second day more urgent. Something in his posture shifting toward the kind of contained alertness she associated with operations that had moved from planning to execution. She kept working. She completed the analytical document on page 47 and the pages that followed. A full 14 pages in her small, precise handwriting, covering every device, every location, every construction signature, the circle map, the transmitter analysis, the aerial imagery description, the timeline of her reports and Reese's responses, the message from Major Chen, and her hypothesis about the contractor connection. She cross-referenced everything internally so that a reader could start on page 47 and follow the logic through to the conclusion without needing any prior knowledge. She wrote it to be read by someone who didn't know her. She wrote it to be found. On the second evening, Okafor knocked on the container door. He came in and sat on the ammo crate without being invited, which he'd started doing 2 months ago and which she'd stopped objecting to, because sometimes a person needed someone in the room who wasn't going to ask questions or offer analysis. "There's a convoy rotation tomorrow," he said. "Resupply run to the eastern outposts, Black Ravine route." She looked up. "Why Black Ravine? The clearance from 5 days ago is—" "Reese approved it, says the route is clear." "The route is clear of the 3 devices I found. If the builder has been back—" "I know." Okafor's voice was quiet. He was staring at the map. "Hargrove is the convoy commander again." She was already reaching for her notebook. "Who's on the EOD tasking?" "You and me." He paused. "Reese cut the secondary EOD team. Says the first clearance establishes baseline safety." The phrase was so technically incorrect that she had to take a slow breath before responding. "Baseline safety," she said. His words. She looked at the map. Then she looked at the 14 pages she'd written on, and after page 47, and at the circle at Wadi Khosrow, and at the notation about contractor hardware and compromised reporting chains. "Okafor," she said, "Staff Sergeant, tomorrow morning before we load out, I need you to do something for me." She tore a page from the back of the notebook. She wrote Donovan's name and contact information. "Find Donovan. Tell him, Black Ravine again, tomorrow, reduced EOD element. Tell him I said, the document is complete." Okafor took the paper. He looked at it, then at her. "You think something's going to happen?" "I think reduced EOD coverage on a route where a sophisticated builder has been active is not a responsible operational decision." She met his eyes. "I also think that if something does happen, Donovan needs to know the notebook is ready." Okafor folded the paper carefully and put it in his breast pocket. He sat for a moment longer on the ammo crate, not speaking. "You're a good soldier," he said finally. It came out a little rough, like he'd practiced a different version. "Get some sleep, Danny." He left. She turned back to the notebook and read through everything on page 47 one more time, checking for gaps, correcting 2 small factual errors, adding a final note at the bottom of the last page. "If this document is found without me, the notebook belongs to Staff Sergeant Emily Carter, EOD, FOB, Sentinel. Everything in it is accurate and verifiable. Start with page 47. She closed the notebook and put it in her left breast pocket, directly over her heart. Different pocket than usual. She wanted to feel it there. Black Ravine looked the same as it always did. Cold, narrow, the walls rising to a strip of pale sky. The sound of engines bouncing back off the rock, flattened and strange. Emily rode in the second vehicle this time, modified tasking, which meant she'd be closer to the front when the assessment was needed. Okafor was in the seat behind her, silent, his rifle across his knees. Hargrove was in the lead vehicle. Donovan had found her at the motor pool before they loaded out, and he'd looked at her for a moment with an expression she didn't have a name for. Something between professional concern and something older. And then he'd said only, "I'll be monitoring the radio." He wasn't in the convoy. She'd understood what that meant. He was doing something with his calls, something that required him to be at the FOB. She'd understood, and she'd gotten in the vehicle. 400 meters into the ravine, she saw it. Not a stone this time, a shadow. A slight difference in the way the road surface caught the light at a specific point. A disturbance in the gravel that was 3 days old at most, visible only because she'd spent 7 months training herself to read exactly this kind of signal. "Stop," she said. The convoy stopped. She got out and walked forward alone. Standard protocol: one person approaches, everyone else holds position. She walked slowly, reading the ground, her kit on her back, her notebook in her pocket. The disturbance in the gravel was at the midpoint of the ravine, approximately the same position as the previous midpoint device, but not the same location. The builder had moved it 14 meters to the east, adjusted for the probability that the previous location would receive extra scrutiny. Adaptive. She knelt and began to probe with her detector. Positive reading at 12 inches. She started to excavate carefully, exposing the device layer by layer. It was different. Not the construction. The knot was the same. The wire gauge was the same. The builder's signature was present and clear, but the configuration had changed. This device was connected to a secondary trigger she hadn't seen in any previous Style 7. A pressure plate on a separate wire, running beneath the road surface to a position 30 meters back toward the convoy's stop position. Bidirectional initiation. If she disabled the forward trigger, the device could still be detonated by the second pressure plate, a plate that was now directly under the vehicle she'd ridden in. She sat back and stared at the exposed assembly. The convoy was sitting on a detonator. She keyed her radio. Her voice came out completely level. "Hargrove, I need the convoy to move forward, not back. Forward, slowly, 10 meters at a time. Do not reverse." "Say again, Carter?" "There is a secondary trigger beneath the third vehicle. Moving backward will initiate it. Move forward 10 meters on my command." She was already working the forward pressure plate, trying to determine if she could isolate it while the vehicles moved. "On my mark. Now!" The convoy crept forward. The pressure plate under the third vehicle cleared the secondary trigger without initiating. She heard herself exhale. "Hold position," she said. "Stay clear of reversing." She looked at the main device. The forward assembly, still intact, now isolated from the secondary. The main charge was large, larger than anything she'd seen from this builder. 6 kilograms at minimum, possibly 8, packed into 3 containers connected by det cord, running in a Y configuration to a central initiator. 3-point blast dispersal, designed to maximize fragmentation across a wide area. This wasn't reconnaissance data, this was execution. She looked at the initiator. It was military grade, not pressure plate, not command wire. A timer circuit, set and left, no need for a trigger man. She checked the timer, 12 minutes. She'd spent 4 minutes on the excavation. She had 8 minutes to disrupt a Y configuration det cord assembly with a central timer initiator, in a ravine where the walls blocked any safe standoff, with a convoy of 14 people behind her who could not go backward. She reached for her tools. 6 minutes in, she found the third wire. It wasn't part of the Y configuration. It ran from the central initiator, not to a charge, but back along the road surface. Below the gravel, barely visible, toward the bridge approach at the ravine's southern exit. The exit device. It had been placed already. It was also on the timer circuit. 1 initiator, 3 charges. The main midpoint device, the exit bridge device, and, she was suddenly certain, something she hadn't found yet at the entry point. 3 locations, 1 timer. 12 minutes originally, now 6. Total containment. She understood in that moment what she was looking at. Not a single device. A system. The entire ravine was the device. And the timer was already running. She made the calculation in approximately 4 seconds. She could disrupt the central initiator. She had the tools and the knowledge to do it. But the initiator was under 8 inches of rock and compacted earth, and the excavation alone would take 5 minutes, and she had 6. And the disruption itself required precise access to the timer circuit, which she couldn't assess without full excavation. Or, she could sever the det cord connections between the initiator and all 3 charges, isolating each charge individually. That was a 2-minute job. The charges would still be live, active pressure plates, active timer still running but disconnected, but the det cord interruption would prevent sympathetic detonation. The convoy could move through the isolated forward charge on the shoulder, clear the ravine, and she could complete the disarm from a safe position after evacuation. Except, the exit device was at the bridge. The det cord to the exit ran below the road surface. She couldn't sever it without knowing exactly where it ran, and she had 6 minutes. The convoy could clear the forward charge if she severed the main Y configuration, but they would still be driving over an active pressure plate connected to the exit device at the bridge. Unless she went to the bridge. Unless she went to the bridge, located the exit device, and severed its connection herself, and then stayed there, because there wasn't time to do that and get back. She sat in the dirt of the ravine with the device open in front of her and the notebook against her chest, and 6 minutes on a timer she couldn't see, and she made the decision. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, the way she made all decisions. By reading the geometry, identifying the option that saved the most people, and choosing it. She keyed her radio. Her voice was completely steady. "Hargrove, I need the convoy to prepare to move on my signal. Full speed through the ravine to the FOB. Do not stop for any reason until you are clear of the southern exit." A pause. "Donovan, if you can hear me, find page 47. Then she started moving toward the bridge. She severed the Y configuration det cord first. 2 cuts, 40 seconds, done. The forward charge was now isolated. Behind her, the convoy began to move. She ran. The bridge was 300 meters south. She ran with her kit on her back and her notebook against her chest, and the timer running in her head. 4 minutes, maybe 3. And she ran because there was nothing else to do, and because the geometry was what it was, and she had read it correctly. She found the exit device 12 meters from the bridge approach. Left shoulder, exactly where she'd predicted 7 days ago, in a notebook she was now running toward in her breast pocket. She cut the det cord connection. The convoy was on the bridge above her when she did it. She heard the Humvees crossing, the particular rumble of heavy vehicles on old concrete. One by one, she counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 vehicles clear. She sat down in the gravel under the bridge and put her back against the concrete abutment and opened her notebook to page 47. The timer ran out while she was reading it. The midpoint device initiated. The blast wave came down the ravine like a fist. Not the shock wave she described in technical manuals, but the physical reality of it. The way the air moved all at once. The sound that wasn't a sound so much as a pressure change across her whole body. The bridge above her absorbed most of it. The rock walls channeled the rest upward. She was still there when the echo finished. She checked herself. Alive, intact, ears ringing, dust in everything. She'd been outside the primary blast radius by 11 meters. The exit device she disarmed was a meter to her left, inert. She sat under the bridge for a moment longer, her back against the concrete, the notebook open in her lap. Then she closed it, put it in her pocket, and stood up to finish the job. The midpoint charge had detonated, but not fully. The main Y configuration had been disrupted, and the blast was partial, consuming one of the 3 containers but leaving 2 intact. She would have to deal with those. She would also need to locate and confirm the entry device she suspected existed. She walked back into the ravine alone. The dust was still settling. The dust was still in her throat when she found the entry device. It was where she'd predicted. 30 meters inside the ravine mouth, left shoulder, buried 22 inches. The builder had placed it last. She could tell by the compression pattern of the surrounding soil. This was the most recent disturbance in the ravine. Set after the other 2 were already in the ground. The final piece of the containment system. She knelt beside it and began to probe. Her hands were steady. She noted that the way she noted everything, as information, as data about her current state and capability. Steady hands. Good. The ringing in her ears had faded to a low hum. Her vision was clear. The partial detonation of the midpoint device had been close enough to push her back 3 meters, but not close enough to injure her. And she'd confirmed this with a systematic self-assessment before she started walking. Limbs intact, no blood, no diminished sensation in her fingers or feet. She was functional. The entry device was the simplest of the 3. Single container, pressure plate, command wire. The original configuration, the baseline. The knot at the detonator cap was the same knot she'd first documented 6 weeks ago on Route Atlanta. Same builder, same hands. She disarmed it in 28 minutes. Methodical, thorough. She photographed every layer as she went, even now, because the record mattered and she'd been doing it for 7 months, and stopping now would have felt like a failure of something she didn't have a word for. Discipline. Maybe that was the word. When the device was neutralized and bagged, she sat in the dirt of the ravine and radioed the FOB. FOB Sentinel, this is Carter. Black Ravine is clear. 3 devices neutralized. Requesting extraction at the ravine entrance. A pause. Then Donovan's voice, rough in a way that told her he'd been listening to the radio for a long time. Copy, Carter. Vehicle is already moving. She sat with her back against the ravine wall and waited. The sun had moved again, the shadows shifting, the temperature in the cut dropping sharply. She could see her breath now. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the place where the midpoint device had partially detonated. A scorched section of road surface, rock chips scattered in a radius, the smell of burnt composite still heavy in the air. She thought about the person who had built all of this, the patience of it, the precision, the knot tied the same way every time, in Afghanistan, in the cold, in bad light, under pressure. A discipline that mirrored her own in a way that was uncomfortable to acknowledge. She didn't know who they were. She knew their work. She knew their hands. She wrote that in the notebook, on the page after page 47. I know your hands. I don't know your name. Then she heard the vehicle. Donovan drove himself. He came alone, which was a violation of about 4 different protocols. And when he got out of the Humvee and walked toward her, she could see in his face that the protocols had not crossed his mind. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her, the scraped knees, the dust coating everything, the sealed disposal bags beside her. And then he looked at the scorched section of road where the midpoint device had gone. You cleared it, he said. 3 devices. Ravine is clean. She stood up, brushing dust from her knees by habit. The midpoint charge partially detonated. 2 containers are inert. I've documented and bagged them. 1 container is missing, probably consumed in the blast. Carter. The entry device was a standard configuration. No complications. The exit device I disarmed before the... Emily, he said her first name. She stopped talking. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up the disposal bags and walked to the Humvee. She followed. They loaded the bags in the back and got in and drove out of the ravine in silence, the rock walls sliding past, the strip of sky widening as they reached the exit, the valley opening around them in a flood of late afternoon light. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The convoy is safe, she said finally. 14 people in 5 vehicles, all confirmed at FOB. He kept his eyes on the road. Hargrove radioed in when you called the clearance. He said, a pause. He said he didn't understand what you did under the bridge until the blast went off. The exit device was connected to the central timer. If I hadn't severed it before the midpoint initiated, the bridge charge would have fired while the convoy was crossing. I know. His voice was completely flat. I did the math. The road stretched ahead of them, straight and open, the afternoon light turning everything to amber. She watched the terrain, the ridge lines, the dry creek beds, the places where the ground folded. Still reading, she couldn't stop reading. My calls went through, Donovan said. She looked at him. Before you loaded out this morning, my contact outside this command structure confirmed the Meridian connection. They've been building a case for 3 months. He paused. They didn't know about Wadi Khosrow. They didn't have the circle map. They didn't have the construction signature timeline. Another pause. They needed exactly what's on page 47. She was quiet. They're moving on Wadi Khosrow tonight, he said. Joint element, outside the provincial command structure entirely. His jaw was tight. Reese has been flagged. The Major Chen response is under review. She processed this. So it was already in motion. Parts of it, you accelerated the timeline. The Black Ravine clearance, both of them, forced Meridian's hand. They moved up their operation. He glanced at her. Your contact with the devices changed their schedule. They thought they had more time. She thought about the vehicle tracks at Wadi Khosrow. Heavier loads going in. The accelerated timeline she'd identified in the aerial imagery. They were still in preparation phase, she said. Yes. Whatever they were planning for, it wasn't ready. You interrupted it. The FOB was visible ahead now. She could see the walls, the antennas, the flag. The same view she'd had from the ravine wall during the first climb, miniaturized by distance. What were they planning? She asked. Donovan was quiet for a moment. That's what tonight is for. The FOB felt different when they returned. Emily couldn't have said exactly what had changed. The same structures, the same dust, the same sounds of generators in distant weapons qualification. But something in the social texture of the place had shifted. Soldiers she passed looked at her differently. Not with the professional respect she was accustomed to, something more direct, less managed. Hargrove met her at the motor pool gate. He was 26 years old and trying to compose his face into the expression of a professional soldier reporting to a professional colleague, and not entirely succeeding. She could see in his eyes something that she recognized as the aftermath of understanding, the specific look of a person who had just grasped, fully, how close a thing had been. Staff Sergeant Carter, he said. Lieutenant, I need to write a formal after-action report. He paused. I want to make sure I accurately describe what happened at the bridge approach. I'll give you a full technical statement, sir. That's... He stopped, started again. The secondary trigger under the third vehicle. You identified that before we initiated the forward movement. Yes, sir. And the timing on the exit device. You severed the det cord connection before the central initiator fired. With approximately 90 seconds to spare. She said it without particular emphasis. It was a fact. He looked at her for a moment. I've submitted a preliminary report to Brigade, he said. I want you to know that the language is accurate, all of it. She understood what he was telling her. His report would document the sequence clearly, the decision to route through Black Ravine, again on reduced EOD coverage, the device configuration, her actions, on record, permanently. Thank you, sir, she said. He nodded and walked away. She watched him go and thought about what Donovan had said, the chain between the information and the decision. Hargrove was young and straight, and he was going to put it all in writing, and that mattered, and she was glad. She went to the EOD workspace and laid out the bag components from the entry device. She photographed them one final time, labeled each photograph, and added them to the device log. 43 devices, now 46 including today's 3. She wrote up the technical summary for all 3 Black Ravine devices. Construction specifications, placement depths, timer circuit specifications, detonator configuration, in the precise, unadorned language of a field report. At the bottom of the summary she wrote, Meridian Technical Solutions. All 3 devices consistent with external facilitation. See page 47 for full analytical documentation. She signed it and dated it and put it in the evidence envelope with the photographs. Then she took the notebook from her breast pocket and held it for a moment. 14 pages. Her small, precise handwriting. All of it. She put it back. The operation at Wadi Khosrow launched at 0200. Emily was not part of it. She was at FOB Sentinel, awake, sitting on the sandbag outside her bee hut with her notebook in her hands, listening to the radio traffic that Donovan had agreed to patch through to his personal receiver and share with her in summary. She heard the movement phases. She heard the breach. She heard the calls go up as the Kalat compound was secured. 2 personnel detained, 4 others who had apparently vacated within the previous 12 hours. She heard the logistics assessment, The prefabricated modules contained equipment that the assault team's technical expert described in terse radio shorthand as significant. She heard one more thing, a call sign she didn't recognize, using a frequency she hadn't known was active, asking a question that told her everything. Was the documentation recovered? The answer was negative. Site appears sanitized. She wrote that exchange down in the notebook. Then she wrote, "They knew we were coming. Someone told them. Not Donovan, not Hargrove, someone higher." She closed the notebook and looked up at the sky. The stars over Afghanistan were ridiculous. Too many, too bright, the kind of sky that felt like an argument for something she couldn't name. Donovan appeared beside her at some point. She hadn't heard him coming. He sat on the adjacent sandbag and looked at the sky for a moment before speaking. "Wadi Khosrow is secure," he said. "Two detainees. Significant intelligence haul from the equipment left behind." He paused. "They moved their key personnel and operational documents out before the assault. 12-hour window at most. Someone warned them." Yes. She thought about Major Chen. The immediate escalation of her reconnaissance request. The hold placed on incoming queries. The phrase, "under review," that meant, "we need to assess whether you're a problem." "Reese," she said. "Reese is being interviewed as of 0300. He's not the primary." Donovan's voice was measured. "He's a link in a chain. Someone above him, probably at brigade level, fed the warning. Reese managed his end, delaying your reports, routing your analysis into dead channels, keeping you busy with approved tasking." He paused. He probably told himself it was compartmentalized intelligence he wasn't cleared for, that he was following legitimate direction. Did he know about Webb? The question sat in the cold air. "I don't know," Donovan said. "That's what the interviews are for." She absorbed this. Webb. The photograph in the helmet pad. The two sugars. 3 weeks from going home. "The two detainees," she said. "What are they saying?" "Nothing yet, but the equipment left behind, it's significant. Enough to reconstruct the operation's scope and identify the external principles." He looked at her. "The Meridian connection is solid. This is going up the chain fast." She nodded. She was thinking about the call she'd heard. Was the documentation recovered? Negative. Site appears sanitized. The question had been asked in the first 90 seconds of the site assessment, before any other question about personnel or equipment or objectives. The first thing they'd wanted to know was whether the documents were gone. "They were worried about their own paper trail," she said. "Whatever they left at Wadi Khosrow, they moved their documents first before anything else." Which means the documents are significant. Which means someone, somewhere, has a complete record of what Meridian was actually doing in this province. She looked at the notebook in her hands. "And they wanted to make sure it couldn't be compared against anything we had." Donovan looked at the notebook too. "Page 47, he said. "Page 47, she said. 3 days later, 2 men from a unit whose identification she wasn't given came to FOB Sentinel and sat with Emily in the EOD workspace for 6 hours. They were professional and thorough, and they asked questions that told her, by their precision, by the things they already knew when they asked, that they had access to intelligence she hadn't seen, and that her analysis had been cross-referenced against sources she wasn't cleared for. Several times during the 6 hours, one of them would read something from her notebook and then look at the other with a brief, contained expression that she interpreted as confirmation. Her analysis matched, not partially, substantially. The Meridian connection, the knot signature timeline, the procurement trail she'd identified through the technical manual database, the circle map with Wadi Khosrow at its center, the assessment that the device network was reconnaissance infrastructure rather than primary offensive capability, all of it mapped against what they knew. At the end of the 6 hours, the senior of the 2 men, he'd given her a name that she was fairly certain was not his real name, put the notebook on the table between them, and looked at her. "How long did it take you to build this?" he said. 7 weeks for the device pattern, 3 days for the analytical document. She paused. "I wrote the analytical document in 3 days because I wasn't sure how much time I had." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite respect, something more specific than that. Recognition, maybe. The look of a person who had learned to read the same kinds of signals she read, and who was reading her now the same way she read ground. "The Meridian operation was 2 years in preparation," he said. "Your device logs are the first externally generated documentation that maps the full scope of the provincial network." He paused. "Without the timeline and the circle map, we would have had the Wadi Castro site, but not the satellite operations. Without the satellite operations, the principals remain insulated." She understood what he was saying. "Page 47 fills the gap," she said. "Page 47 fills a significant gap." He stood up. "We'll need the notebook for evidentiary processing. You'll receive a copy." She looked at the notebook on the table. 7 months of fieldwork, 46 devices documented. The small rituals of her handwriting, the knot diagrams, the placement sketches, the wire gauge notations, the precise measurements that only meant something if you knew what you were reading. Webb's death documented in a single factual sentence on a page that also contained device specifications, because that was what the day had contained, and she had written everything. Her 3-day analytical document, starting on page 47, written in the long hours after Okafor had left and the FOB had gone quiet, written for a reader she couldn't name. The notebook was battered, the cover was scuffed, and the spine had been reinforced twice with green tape. There was a dark stain on the lower right corner from a device she'd been working when it rained. Motor oil or hydraulic fluid, she'd never determined which. The pages were dense and close, her handwriting small by habit, economizing space the way you learn to economize everything in the field. She had carried it for 7 months against her body. Different pockets, but always against her. She pushed it across the table. "There's a note on the last page," she said. "Before I wrote the analytical document, I wasn't sure who was going to read it, so I wrote a note explaining where to start." She paused. "You can ignore that part." He looked at the last page. He read the note. "If this document is found without me, the notebook belongs to Staff Sergeant Emily Carter, EOD, FOB Sentinel. Everything in it is accurate and verifiable. Start with page 47. He looked up at her. "I won't ignore it," he said. She nodded once and looked at the wall where the map had been. The device locations in red, the blue circle at Wadi Khasro. She'd taken it down that morning to submit with the evidentiary package. The wall was bare now, just the pinholes remaining. The formal outcome took 6 weeks to filter down to FOB Sentinel, arriving in pieces, through channels both official and otherwise. Donovan told her the most important parts first, the morning after the Wadi Khasro operation, sitting in the early light on the sandbags outside her bee hut. He was careful about what he attributed to confirmed sources and what remained unverified, which was one of the things she trusted about him. He didn't round up. 2 Meridian principals were identified and under active investigation by a joint task force that operated above the provincial command level. The Wadi Khasro compound had yielded equipment and partial documentation sufficient to establish the scope of their provincial operation. A contractor-facilitated route denial and intelligence collection program that had been running in various forms for 18 months. The IED network was the collection mechanism. The devices weren't meant to kill Americans, primarily. They were meant to map American response patterns, route clearance capabilities, and convoy scheduling, building a tactical intelligence picture that would be sold. Sold to whom was still being determined. Captain Reese was removed from command pending investigation. The charges were not yet formal, but the direction was clear. He had received direction from the compromised brigade-level contact and had managed his end with the particular small-scale obedience of a man who'd convinced himself he was following legitimate orders. The investigation would determine how much he'd understood versus how much he'd chosen not to ask. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb's death was under formal review as a consequence of the compromised command decision to route through Black Ravine on reduced EOD coverage. Webb had 3 weeks from going home. The builder, the person whose not signature Emily had documented across 46 devices, was not among the Wadi Khosrow detainees. Their identity was unknown. The knot pattern had been submitted to the full device archive and matched to 23 devices across 3 provinces, the earliest dating to 14 months prior. They were still out there. Emily sat with that for a while. She had filled a fresh notebook by then. Standard issue, same size as the old one, kept in the same pocket, same side. The new notebook had its own page 47, which currently contained a technical assessment of a device type she'd encountered for the first time the previous week, near a village south of the FOB. Pressure plate. No knot. Different hands. There were always different hands. Donovan found her in the workspace one afternoon, writing up the new device assessment. He sat on the ammo crate and watched her work for a moment. "There's talk of a commendation," he said. "Hargrove submitted something. The people who came to take your notebook submitted something." She kept writing. "Commendations are above my pay grade to think about." "They're not asking you to think about it," he paused. "There's also talk of a new assignment, Brigade EOD advisory position, province-wide scope." She stopped writing. "Which would mean leaving the FOB," she said. "Which would mean leaving the FOB." He shrugged slightly. "Wider operational picture, more data, better chain of command now that the compromised elements are being removed." She considered this. She looked at the wall where the map had been, the bare surface with its pinholes. "I haven't finished the device log here," she said. "There's a new signature in the south, different hands, different construction style. It needs documentation before I move on." Donovan smiled. It was small and brief, but it was there. "Of course," he said. On a Thursday morning in November, Jack Donovan built a small display case. He made it from a piece of clear acrylic he'd found in the FOB workshop and a strip of wood that he'd sanded smooth and stained with boot polish, because he didn't have anything else. It was not elegant. It was not official. It was the work of a man who needed to do something with his hands and had decided this was the thing. He placed the case on the shelf above his workstation in the contractor advisory office, a narrow room he shared with 2 other advisors who were currently both in the field. Inside the case, a photocopy of page 47. The original was in an evidence archive somewhere above his clearance level. The photocopy had been provided, as promised, along with a copy of the full notebook. He'd made a second copy of this specific page and cut it to fit the case. 14 pages of Emily Carter's handwriting, photographically reduced to fit behind the acrylic. Her precise, small letters, the device sketches. The circle map with the coordinates he now knew pointed at a compound that no longer existed in its original form. The bullet points under external involvement, indicators, written before she had access to any classified source, mapping the same network that a joint task force had spent months building toward. He had read the full notebook 3 times since receiving the copy. The second time, he'd paid particular attention to the margins, the small annotations she'd made in even smaller writing when the main text ran out of room. There was one on page 49 that he kept coming back to. "Same hands, different valley. Someone taught them." Written in the margin beside a knot diagram, the ink slightly different, added after the main text, a thought that had arrived later and needed space. She had been 6 steps ahead of everybody. He had seen it and said so, in writing, to his contacts. It hadn't been fast enough. He had made peace with that in the way he made peace with most things. Not completely and not quickly, but functionally. Enough to work, enough to keep reading the landscape in finding the patterns and pushing information up the chain toward people who might act on it in time. He sat down at his workstation. Through the window behind it, the plateau stretched in every direction, brown and flat and indifferent under a bone-colored sky. He thought about what she'd said when he told her the operation was in motion. So it was already in motion. Not triumph, not relief, just the careful acknowledgement of a fact, and then the next question. She had always moved to the next question. He thought about her on the rock face, descending fast with rounds hitting the stone above her. Her voice on the radio, completely level. Taking fire, descending, move faster, Staff Sergeant. He thought about Webb's photograph, the daughter on the porch swing. Emily had seen it and said nothing, and written it down somewhere inside herself in the way that precise, observant people write things they can't do anything about. He sat down at his workstation. He had 2 reports to write and 3 advisory briefs to review. The work was always there. He'd learned, a long time ago, that the work being there was not a burden, but a structure, a way of staying functional, of channeling the energy that would otherwise pool and stagnate. He began to write. An hour later, a younger contractor, new to the FOB, first rotation, still slightly stunned by the landscape, came into the advisor office looking for a manual and noticed the display case. "What's that?" the man said. Donovan looked up. He looked at the case. He thought about how to answer a question that had a short answer and a long answer, neither of which was quite right. "Documentation," he said finally. The young man looked at the case a moment longer, then found his manual and left. Donovan went back to his report. Outside, the wind moved across the plateau in slow, rolling waves, pushing dust against the walls of the FOB with a sound like something breathing. The flags snapped and straightened. The generators ran. The work continued. The official record read, "Killed in action." Those 3 words appeared in the duty log, the casualty report, the notification paperwork, the after-action summary. They were accurate in the most technical sense. She had been present at a site where ordnance detonated, and the blast had been significant, and the blast had killed her. What the official record did not contain was the sequence, the decision under the bridge, the 4 seconds of calculation, the geometry of 3 charges in one timer and 14 people on a crossing, and the choice that followed from it. The run down the ravine floor with the kid on her back and the notebook against her chest. The severing of the det cord connection with 90 seconds remaining. The choice to stay. The official record also did not contain the 14 pages, the circle map, the meridian connection that she had identified before anyone with access to classified sources had connected the same dots. The 6 hours in the workspace with the 2 men who were not using their real names. The moment when she pushed the notebook across the table, note on the last page still visible, and one of those men said, "I won't ignore it." Official records contain what they contained. She had always known this. It was part of why she wrote everything down. The unofficial record was more complete. Hargrove's after-action report, Okafor's witness statement, the evidentiary submission from the 2-man team, Captain Weiss's notes from his conversation with Donovan, the reconstruction of the Black Ravine device system, built from Emily's documentation and used as the primary technical reference in the subsequent investigation. The Meridian prosecution case, in which page 47 and its following pages appeared as Exhibit 17, the first externally generated documentation mapping the full provincial network. She died without witnesses. The notebook survived her by 6 weeks of fieldwork and several thousand miles of evidence transfer, and an indefinite period in a classified archive, where it sits in acid-free storage between the submissions of 2 people whose names Emily never knew. And in a narrow contractor advisory office at FOB Sentinel, behind a piece of clear acrylic and a strip of wood stained with boot polish, her handwriting is still visible on a photocopy that is not elegant and not official, and is exactly the right size for the space it occupies.